In this lesson, we will learn about inverse kinematics. Now, before we can understand what inverse kinematics is, we first need to understand a term called forward kinematics. So with forward kinematics, it's as simple as rotating objects down a hierarchy. So as we start to go through and rotate our joints, this is known as forward kinematics. It's great to use when animating arms if we need a very fast arc. However, with inverse kinematics, we're able to inverse the rotation of our chain as it tries to follow an end goal. So let's take a closer look at this end goal and how to work with Cinema 4D's IK system, because it's really neat. But before we do, I'd like to point out to you exactly why we'd want to use inverse kinematics here. You could imagine if we wanted our fueling line to stay connected to our ship, so we start to animate the ship moving around, we then need to animate the fueling line using forward kinematics to try to have the fueling line match as close as possible. And that can be very tedious, especially with the amount of joints we're working with. So with inverse kinematics, what we could do then is simply take the end goal and connect it right to our ship, and as the ship moves, automatically our chain will follow. So really neat stuff. And you could do even more with Cinema 4D's inverse kinematic system, and we'll take a look at that more in depth when we get into the rigging section of this series. But what I'll do is go in and hide the aircraft, and let's go ahead and create an IK tag for this chain. So typically you'll want to add the tag to the first joint that you'd like to have tied to this system, which right now is our very first joint, fueling line 01. So with that selected, let's go ahead and choose tags, character tags, and add the IK tag. Alright, so from there I'll go to the tag tab. Let's go in and start to define a few things. We need to add our end joint so it knows where the end of the chain is. So that's joint 41. Let's go ahead and find it and add it to the end field. Now you can see we have this visual connection between the start and end of our chain. Alright, so now what we could do is go ahead and add a goal object that we can animate the chain with. So I'll go ahead and choose Add Goal. You can see that it has been added to the very end of the chain. To take a closer look at that, if we were to go ahead and collapse our chain's hierarchy, here's the goal object. We can start to move that around, and you can see that now we're getting some really nice control over our fueling line. Let's go ahead and do a few things, because right now the goal is a bit difficult to select from our viewport. So we'll go to our Object tab and we'll set the display to Sphere. It's getting cut off in the video, but it's the last choice. And then next, let's go ahead and set the orientation to XY and the radius to 60. Much better. What we'll also do is go to coordinates and we'll freeze its transform. So as we start to have fun with our IK system, if we need to get back to this very position, well, it's either a matter of zeroing out these values or heading over to the character menu, commands, and choosing Reset PSR. Alright, so at this point, if we were to go ahead and start to move our chain, we'll notice that there are just a few issues with our current system. One is that the chain doesn't quite follow our IK goal as it gets past its limit. The reason why that is because of the type of solver we're using. So we'll take a look at that. Another issue we have is that we eventually run into lagging when we get past that threshold. So that's another thing we'll fix in this lesson. So let's go ahead and start with the first issue, our chain not extending. That's simply because right now we are using a 2D solver. Let's go ahead and switch this to the 3D, which does its best to match to the end goal's position. So now you can see that we're starting to really stretch this chain out and get the control we need. Alright, great. Now, the lagging issue is because of the max iterations of this chain, which is simply what drives the chain's position so that it can do its best to follow the solve. So you can see as we start to extend our chain, what we have is a really nice straight line, which is great. However, if we were to drop that max iteration count, which we could do from our Advanced tab, right now it's set to a very high amount, so we can get some great results from our our solver. But watch, if we were to go ahead and set this to about 10, no longer do we have the control we'd like to see. So ideally what you do is drop the value, not this low of course, but you'd want to drop your value when you're animating. And then when you're ready to render, you can go ahead and increase it back to the default of 9,999. And it's a pretty high value, but you're going to bring it back to that for the best results from your chain. So I like to actually work with 300. I find that works very well. The chain isn't perfectly straight, but it's just enough where the viewer really doesn't have any clue that it is not fully extended. So this is great. We can now gain speed back from our chain by just simply adjusting our max iteration count. All right, well, we have our IK system in place. Let's go ahead and bring the goal object back to its default position with reset PSR. And what we could do is stop the lesson here so that in the next lesson we can have our fueling line chain deform the fueling line mesh.